Thank you, Ferdinand, for that introduction. And it's quite an honor to be the speaker in the last ECOLOPES series under your current funding regime. So I will try to do justice to the great series that you all have put together. I'm here joining from Victoria, Canada, on the west coast of North America. So it's the early morning here. I understand people are joining from around the world, but many are in Europe. So good afternoon to everyone there. And I don't need, I think, to do any of this about me work because you've introduced me quite well there, Ferdinand. But I will talk briefly about UBHub, or the Urban Biodiversity Hub, and what we are, just so that people can understand where I'm coming from. I'm one of the founders of this organization and continue to run the organization as the Chief Operations Officer. And we as an organization seek to help cities understand better their relationship with nature, and that's both positive and negative impacts, and how they can change their practices and the way that they think about those impacts, from both, kind of theoretical, conceptual ideas about like ecological footprinting and things like that, but then also what they can feasibly monitor and measure depending on what their context is and their capacity levels. We also link global frameworks and things like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Global Biodiversity Framework targets with local strategies, both through reporting and indicators of measuring, and also just recommendations for whole of government approach that incorporates local and subnational actions into these global frameworks. So we offer expertise on policies and strategies for nature, knowledge in sustainable cities and international frameworks, strategic planning, analysis and indicators, and also multicultural facilitation for output-oriented workshops, which is the photograph there is one that we did in Berlin with the Science-Based Targets Network in the development of the nature science-based targets for cities that will be coming out this year. And then we also host the world's largest database on current strategies and reports that are being put out by local governments on urban biodiversity. So you can take a look at our website at ubhub.org to take a look at that database, and you can search and filter it for your own purposes as well. So we offer that freely to anyone that's doing work in this area to help improve the field. So today I'll be talking about urban biodiversity strategies, frameworks, and indicators, and just doing kind of a broad review of our recent work and findings in the field. And I welcome, questions, comments. I know many of you here may be experts in this area as well, so it would be great to have a bit of dialogue. So feel free to raise your hand, or hopefully we'll have time at the end for lots of questions. So within strategies, we'll be looking at the benefits that cities have for considering nature and understanding urban impacts on nature, and kind of connecting together those two fields. I found that in my work, usually establishing this kind of foundational idea of why are we talking about cities and nature together is still something that our field is struggling with. So I tend to start my talks this way, and I welcome any input on how best to communicate this idea across both of the disciplines. So what do cities have to do with the conservation of nature? So first, there's your benefits to city inhabitants. So when we're considering nature in cities, we have more inclusive well-being, as we consider ideas like biophilia and benefits to mental and physical health for people, supporting livelihoods of people who depend on the status of nature in the city and natural resources, and the fulfillment of your life as a whole person. Mentally, physically, and spiritually as well. Nature also helps with the resilience of cities in reducing the risk of disasters, and increasing food security, and increasing the self-sufficiency of the city for resources like water. And then the third reason is the ecological health of the city itself. So to have healthy, abundant, and diverse species and landscapes, that is a reason in and of itself, and benefits the city. We can also look at globally how much impact do cities really have, and what are we talking about when we talk about urban ecosystems. So in the recent global ecosystem typology work that IUCN has put out that classifies all of the land surface of the world into different ecosystem types. 6% of the land cover in the world is an urban ecosystem classification. So this includes, paved networks of highways and things like that, as well as what we might typically think of as an urban ecosystem. So it's quite a bit of the land cover area on Earth. And then on top of that, the areas where people tend to congregate are also often very high value ecosystems. And they also tend to then be under threat by development of the land. So that means that our largest cities are also in the hotspots around the world. So you can see here that we have 383 cities over a population of 300,000 that are currently sprawling into biodiversity hotspots around the world. So there's that direct land use impact globally that cities have. We can also look at the development of cities and land development potential. So the decisions that a lot of land use planners are currently making and the impacts that cities can have looking forward. So when we look at land development potential looking towards the year of 2100, we are looking at a projected population increase of about 3 billion around the world, accounting for, some cities are decreasing in size, but many places are expanding. So the way that we develop land for that increase in population can make a difference, even at the global scale. So if we were to look at different development patterns that we could take in that to accommodate that population, if we were to take a suburban development pattern, here I'm showing a photograph of the suburbs of Los Angeles as an example. That's about 1,000 people per square kilometer. The area that we would need to develop at that level is about the size of India, which is represented by this brown circle that you can see on the screen. So that's kind of a middle of the road development, and that's how much land would be under development in that sort of degree of suburban level of sprawl. On the other hand, if we were to take a more urban approach, here shown by the city of Paris at a density of 20,000 people per square kilometer, for that development, you can see that the area would be much smaller, represented by the blue circle. And if those people, instead of being more urbanized, if they are in a more rural development pattern, here represented by the average density of the country of Panama at 58 people per kilometer squared, we'd be looking at a circle about the size of Africa. So it makes a huge difference in terms of the land consumption, how much land is under development, and the impacts to natural ecosystems based on the development patterns that we choose to make with these increasing populations. So I like to show this on kind of a global scale so that people can understand the implications of those decisions at that larger scale. We can also look at the indirect impacts of cities in terms of their ecological footprint. So for people that are familiar with the carbon footprints of cities, the ecological footprint is similar, but it's looking more at the overall impacts on nature in terms of global hectares or areas of land that are needed to provide the, whatever resources and services a certain individual or entity is using. So in this case, we're looking at cities and what their total ecological footprint is. So if we look at the ecological footprints of cities, the blue square represents the land area that a city would need to support itself. Then the city itself would be a square about that size, that kind of yellow square. So it's many hundreds of times larger is the area of impact of the city compared to its direct land use. So this is on top of the circles that we saw earlier globally. And you can see how quickly this becomes untenable and unsustainable at the global scale. We can also look at where the ecological footprint is coming from. So one thing that can be surprising is that the area to the left of the square is resource extraction to the city, so through trade networks and that kind of thing, whereas the area to the right is the assimilation of waste coming out of the city. So this includes the carbon footprint, nitrogen, and phosphorus as well. So that ends up being anywhere from 400 to 1,000 times the city area, just needed to assimilate waste coming out of the city. So it's not only about resources coming in, but also impacts going out. So here we can see how significant thinking about those supply chains and trade and where waste is going to, and where supplies are coming in from a city, and how significant that is to nature conservation. So it's not always about what's going on with nature within the boundaries of the city, but also those flows of resources in and out. Okay, so we know also that the building blocks for conservation are located in cities. It's where people live. The majority of people today are in cities. I'm sure we're all aware of that, being an urban group. It's also where the majority of the money is located. So if you're looking for financing and support for conservation, the connections with business, with consumer demand, all of those things, the core of those activities are in cities, and also influence over societal decisions. Decisions about what is a high quality of life, what's a desirable way that people want to live. These things are generally set in an urban condition. So cities are really at the core of these kind of conservation approaches. And that's another reason why they need to be included in the conservation discussion. Okay, so I think that concludes that section. Oh yes, so then we also have what are the impact areas? What can a city really do? And I like to use this diagram, the urban bioshed impact areas diagram, when discussing how a city should approach their strategy for improving their impact on nature. So we can think about, as a city, what are the areas that we're including in our strategy? And typically what's included in a local biodiversity strategy is really just one small section of this diagram, which is usually the land use, conservation, and restoration within boundary in the city. So that smaller green pie piece there. So we help to expand that thinking to include 3 other areas of impact, which is consumption, production, and pollution of the city, to help capture some of that ecological footprint. The societal influence that the city has in terms of, what's seen as an ideal quality of life for inhabitants of the city and visitors. And then to also expand the scale of impact. So not only in boundary, but also in the surrounding areas of the hinterland, and global impacts through telecoupled impacts, such as through trade. And then also encouraging the incorporation of equity and justice principles at the core of all of these decisions. So this diagram kind of helps cities to conceive of what are their impact areas, are they considering each one of these little segments, so that they can have a comprehensive approach to their biodiversity strategy. Okay, so what's happening right now in terms of urban biodiversity planning? We see that there's activities occurring the entire world round. What you see here is a screenshot of the Urban Biodiversity Hub's database. So we flag all kinds of activities that are occurring around the world so that it can be explored and you can figure out what's going on. Of course, there are certain places where more is happening. For example, some of those bubbles that you see popping up in Russia and Russian-speaking countries are more about urban strategies than policies that are occurring at the local government level. Versus if we look at the United Kingdom or Japan, there are actual requirements for local governments to put together like a habitat conservation plan or a biodiversity plan. So they're quite dense in terms of activity. So there's quite a lot of variability the world round, but there is activity happening world round, with over 1,000 cities having some sort of an initiative for biodiversity at some scale. We can then look at the contents of these plans and see how they're incorporating information across the sectors. So here you can see in this diagram some bars of different cities and the content of their biodiversity plans. And you can see, as I had mentioned earlier, that if we think about the segments on the urban bioshed, the majority of these plans are looking at land use and kind of direct conservation within boundary in the city, looking at like parks and natural areas within the city. And less commonly are they looking at social, cultural, educational, and economic linkages between what they're doing and nature. We can also look at what are the global standards that are happening for urban biodiversity strategies. And at this time, there is no one standard that cities are using the world round, though there are different ones that are used more often. So the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, which looks at impacts of cities on pollinators, and particularly the monarch butterfly across North America, has the most number of adherents of any biodiversity framework. We also have quite a few cities that have signed on to the Edinburgh Declaration, but we don't know what the impact of those signatories has been. We also have quite a few subnational and local governments that have done ecological footprinting or have completed the Singapore Index, which is probably the most well-known index for biodiversity in cities. And then cities have started to sign on with Cities with Nature. That number is from 2018. There's now quite a bit more logged into that. The Biophilic Cities Network is another one. And the Urban Nature Indexes or Indices is another framework that's come out recently that I anticipate would have some growth moving forward. We also know from our research on these plans that they tend to make a lot of statements that aren't supported by follow-up in terms of monitoring and measurement. So what you see here in this diagram is within various categories that are often found in a biodiversity plan. Here, using the categories that are set up by the Singapore Index or the city's biodiversity index. We can see that the darkest bar there is statements of intended action within these areas in the plans. So it's quite common that a high percentage of plans would have some sort of action across many of these aspects of the Singapore Index. But what's less common is that they would have some kind of specific measurement that's following up on that action, or some kind of an output, like producing a website for people to use or creating a committee, something like that. So anything that would allow for the follow-up on that action. So we can see that there's a lack of the ability to measure and monitor progress through the plans compared to making statements of desiring to do something. So there's a lack of accountability overall. Okay, so I've kind of covered what's happening in terms of strategies. I now want to look at frameworks, and in this context, when I talk about frameworks, what I mean is programs that are designed to assist with the creation of strategies or monitoring or policies, these kind of things. So what are these kind of larger systems that are designed to help cities to create and implement their strategies? So I'll talk a bit about what's out there, and then I'm going to look in more depth at the urban nature indexes that IUCN has made, and that I'm one of the authors of, so I'm quite familiar with that system. So when we've done a review of current frameworks out there for local governments in nature, there's quite a lot. This list that you see here is the main one that we've used in our research, and we are bringing in only those frameworks that cut across multiple countries. So there's even more if we were to look at frameworks just within certain countries as to how they've, the standards that they've adopted. But for frameworks that cut across many countries and oftentimes many continents, this is the list. So there's quite a lot of different programs out there for cities, and each one has its own sort of focus and approach. So this gets back to the idea of there not being any standards and the system being quite confusing from a practitioner standpoint as to what system works best for them and how to apply it. So we looked at the frameworks and assessed them for how they connect globally to various things like the Global Biodiversity Framework, whether they're designed for local application, and then how comprehensive they are is that final kind of column there, looking at the various pieces of the bioshed and elements like, are they looking at disaster reduction and resilience, like how to what degree are they covering many topics, and found that the urban nature indexes is quite up there in terms of comprehensiveness, but nothing's at 100%. And the EU biodiversity strategy is also quite comprehensive compared to many others. The CS-CAF, which is commonly used in India, is also one that was quite comprehensive and scored well. And the International EcoCity Framework and Standards, which is set up by a firm, the EcoCity builders, set that one up. And that one is also applicable to site level for people that are here in the architecture realm. That can be a good one to look at. So there's a lot of different frameworks, and each one has its own kind of areas of focus. I can also note that at the bottom of this table, which doesn't include all of the frameworks that we assessed, but it's kind of the top ones, the Singapore Index you can see is ranking a little bit lower in terms of comprehensiveness. And that's because it is limited to what's going on within the footprint of the city and focuses primarily on governance, education, and then also your standard kind of parks and land use areas. So here's an example of how the urban nature indexes fared in our recent assessment. looking at thematic comprehensiveness. So here you can get an idea of the categories that we looked at. So we connected climate and nature to the extent to which were they overlapping those, habitat and connectivity, human well-being and equity concerns, and then consumption and pollution were our categories under thematic comprehensiveness. Where you see the green text on the check means that this particular framework did cover those, and where you see the orange text on the X is where that framework did not cover that concern. So this was how we did our analysis. And you can see that the urban nature indexes, which is one of our top comprehensive frameworks, still is missing some areas such as adaptation measures, nature-based mitigation, renewables and energy, green area maintenance, and disaster resilience. But it had very good coverage of many other topics, such as sprawl, education and awareness, equity and justice, governance, water consumption, wildlife trade. It covered a whole lot of other areas. We can also look at whether they're providing guidance in terms of those measures, like we talked about earlier, that many cities are missing measurement and monitoring ongoing guidance. So we looked at whether the cities had relevance to setting targets or setting measurements for their work. So in the case of the urban nature indexes, they have indicators provided as a default, plus some alternatives, and their targets are based on improving trends rather than a fixed number. Though some have fixed numbers, or just find those a little bit less flexible for cities depending on where they're coming from. And then it links to the Global Biodiversity Framework and the SDGs with intention to be applied at the local scale. So we completed this same sort of an analysis for each one of the frameworks, but this gives you an idea. Okay, so then I thought I would get a little bit into the IUCN Urban Nature Indexes, being a new framework and one that I'm quite familiar with that I think has a lot of promise. The guiding characteristics in its development were to be flexible, to provide for different city capacities so that lower capacity cities and higher capacity cities could both use the same standard and could, be compared at a global level in some way through the themes of the program, and would also accommodate various contexts. That it would be comprehensive, looking at the full urban bioshed, although as you can see, it's not 100% comprehensive. Doesn't cover everything, but it covers a lot more than previous frameworks have. Science-based development, where the indicators are as up-to-date as they could be and maintain that up-to-dateness through iterative updates over time. That the scoring is focused on improvement rather than a fixed target. So the benefits there are, for example, if you look at a common target is to have like a 30% tree canopy coverage, say, in the city. But if your city is either well over that number or well under that number, it doesn't really help you much with your target setting. What you really want to be looking at is improving over time, improving your tree canopy coverage. And then that it has a collaborative approach. So it brings in other standards and takes on other indicators. If a city has already completed the Singapore Index, for example, then it already has quite a bit of the urban nature indexes complete, just because it's already incorporated and integrated into the framework. Okay, and then we published the Urban Nature Indexes tool methodology in Nature Partner Journal, which you can feel free to look up and find out more about that to see exactly how we did that. But basically, we brought in quite a few city practitioners in, with some cities participating as survey participants, some being pilot participants, meaning that they looked at how they might theoretically apply the uni to their city and where they would get the data and the type of work that would be involved, and then harness the series of experts that's available through IUCN as well to assess the system across different specialties. So what are the contents of the Urban Nature Index? It's organized under 6 different themes, which you can see here that are kind of loosely based on the DPSIR model. So drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and responses that are often used as a conceptual model for environmental impacts by people. So we start with consumption drivers, then go into human pressures, and then the status of habitats and species. Theme 5 on nature's contributions to people includes kind of ecosystem services in a more comprehensive way. And then governance responses is about, the legal, regulatory, planning, budgetary, all of those sorts of approaches and whether that's being included. So those are the 6 themes. And any city that participates in the Urban Nature Index will complete at least 1 indicator in each one of the themes. And then depending on their capacity, they may complete up to 5 or even 6 indicators within each one of those themes. So here you can see what the indicator topics are within each one of the 6 themes. So cities would choose from among that. So if you were to look at consumption drivers as a city, for example, you might decide, oh, material consumption, we're really interested in that, and we think we can measure that feasibly, so we'll take on that one. And then let's see, we're already measuring our greenhouse gas emissions, so we'll take that one. So then you would look at the next section and decide, between your priorities and what makes sense for you, which indicator topics you're going to measure. So ultimately, every city has a measurement at the thematic level, and then they have their indicator topics. Yeah, so here's that example again. So then within each one of those indicator topics, the uni program has the intent of that topic so that you can be sure that you're covering the intended effect of the indicator if you choose to measure it in a different way. It has a suggested indicator and then instructions as to how to implement that indicator. So in this example, we're looking at the shorelines and riverbanks indicator topic, which is about measuring the health and restoration of aquatic ecosystems via the ratio of naturalized shoreline to engineered shoreline within the boundaries of the system that you're looking at. So it's encouraging naturalization or the maintenance of natural shorelines, both along riparian and coastal areas of the city. Then the sections that aren't shown here is that it also has resources for that indicator and alternative indicators. And the system that we have on the web for this also allows cities to suggest their own indicator. If they have their own way of measuring something that covers the intent of the indicator, they can suggest that, and that can be approved by IUCN for their use as well. So then each indicator that's completed receives a score, starting with the baseline data only score. And then as you have more data available, which if you have historic data can be immediately, allows you to get your trend score. And then the trend score is what gets compiled at the thematic level. So there's an online dashboard that allows cities to log in, put in their information, and produces visuals for what their status is in each one of the indicator topics and themes. Here's an example of Berlin's data at this point. So they're showing like their water withdrawal over time, over several years, for example, greenhouse gas emissions over time. So we've seen that the urban nature indexes helps cities to make a better decisions that are informed by what their actual impacts are on nature and how they can think comprehensively about those impact areas. They can track their performance over time and their progress, and they can use that to compare how they're doing globally, both with the Global Biodiversity Framework and the SDGs, and also other cities that participate in the system. Local governments have reported that this participating in this program makes it easier to comply with their monitoring mandates and to utilize standardized information to evaluate their impact and their progress in public policies, to more efficiently use their resources and efforts, and to have more legitimate achievements so that they can communicate their accomplishments to their constituents. Okay, so that concludes our framework section. I guess I could do a quick check-in before I go into indicators themselves. I'm also not sure what time it is. Can't see the time on any of my devices. Are we doing okay on the time, Ferdinand?
Absolutely. Don't rush.
Okay, great. Any questions or comments on that bit before I move on to specifics and indicators? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. I think there's more time for Q&A afterwards as well. Okay, so when we look at indicators, we want to know what's out there for cities when they're looking at their indicators. So basically, the short answer of that question is there's a lot. There's a lot more than a city would be able to feasibly, compare and make a well-informed decision about which indicators they would like to adopt. And the result of this is that we've found that, generally speaking, cities will choose their own indicators rather than selecting from existing systems, either because they're not aware of what's out there or there's just too many things and no standard. So when we look at where are indicators right now, the diagram that you're seeing here has along the left different sectors or areas of a biodiversity strategy, and then across the top, starting with a few cities with their actual biodiversity plans, and then we get into frameworks. And where we see the color filled in the number 1 means that there are indicators offered either in that biodiversity strategy or in that framework that fall under that category. So you can see that there's not any particular area that is always covered because we don't see any rows that are colored all the way across, nor are there any frameworks really that cover everything, although the SDGs and the Global Biodiversity Framework are some of the most comprehensive, as well as those high scoring frameworks that we looked at before, like the EU Biodiversity Strategy and the Urban Nature Indexes. So that's just looking at where can cities find indicators. And then what I'm going to do here, because there's so much out there, is I'm going to look specifically at sprawl and development related indicators that are closely linked with land use decision making. So if we just unpack that one row, and then we take the various indicators that we've found, there were 146 indicators within those frameworks. So the 26 or so frameworks we saw earlier, we pulled out all the indicators, and there were 146 in total. And then we organized them according to the Global Biodiversity Framework targets. So here you can see the orange boxes are the different Global Biodiversity Framework targets that have to do with land use and sprawl. And then the bullet points that you see below are kind of the areas or the topic areas that there were indicators available for them that link to that topic. So for example, within the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 1, this target is about planning and managing areas to reduce biodiversity loss. So we found indicators that were talking about how one designs buildings, addressing informal settlements, how you set up your plans, directly addressing sprawl, and then addressing other areas that are linked to that, like transport related decisions. So if you take that across all the boxes, you can get an idea of what our process was. We then we ended up expanding to 32 frameworks and the 146 indicators, and we created indicator information sheets for each one of these bullet points that you saw before. So that's like 50 of them when you take each one of those bullets, and each one described all the indicators. We then talked to expert interviews and did an in-person workshop talking about which one of these indicators are more or less effective, what are their drawbacks, from a global context, which ones make more sense in your area, which ones are applicable, to sort of try to figure out, can we identify certain indicators as being more or less useful than others? Okay, so then we were able to score various indicators as whether they had a high impact, whether they were feasible for cities, and whether they were relevant for cities. So if a city doesn't have authority over something, then it wouldn't end up being very relevant for them. And if they can't feasibly impact that thing, maybe they don't have the data, for example, then that would be a lower feasibility. To try to figure out which areas had high impact, high feasibility, and high relevance for that area. So then on the far right, you see the final score this is just a snapshot of some of the themes. So for example, within Target 1, where I talked about buildings, informal settlements, plans, sprawl, and transport, we found that the sprawl and transport indicators scored the highest in terms of having high impact, high feasibility, and high relevance to these things. So if a city wanted to choose indicators within that would directly impact the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 1, it would be advisable to choose indicators that are addressing sprawl and transport from among the list that we had pulled out. Okay, so then in this next slide, we can see the top scoring indicators for each one of those. So if we go back to sprawl and transport under Global Biodiversity Framework Target 1, the sprawl indicator that the experts found was the best was a ratio of land consumption to population growth, or some type of ratio like that that's measuring sprawl. Within transport, it was more around modal share, alternative mode availability, and personal vehicle commute distances and commute lengths. So here you can kind of see some of these results that we found in terms of which indicators were scoring the highest from both practitioners and experts in the field. So, in summary, we can see that while cities are key to conservation efforts, there's a lack of comprehensiveness, of consistency, and standards within the biodiversity strategy and action plans and the tools that support their implementation. So there's a whole load of frameworks and indicators for cities and nature, but no standards. And that means that cities need a lot of support to navigate the possibilities and to develop strategies that will be effective and that link their priorities to the benefits of biodiversity. And that place-based standards need flexibility, but also need to be able to be collated at larger scales so that we can talk about global impacts of city action. So if we look at what's then going to happen in the future and what we see happening in upcoming years, the linkages between local government actions and the global biodiversity framework, this is a major area of interest. Right now at the global biodiversity framework level, they're looking for ways to report actions and contributions from the local level. And this is not really yet set up, although we now have the cities with nature and the regions with nature reporting platforms that are intended to do that. We have yet to see that kind of compiled at the global level. There's also an interest in quantifying the impacts of what cities are doing at all levels of society. So looking more across those sectoral differences and not just your standard kind of conservation, how much land have we preserved? And then development of those reporting mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. And that might be my last slide. Looks like it. Yep. Okay. So now I can give my voice box a break, and I welcome discussion and questions and suggestions from you all.
Follow us in this shift to multi-species design through ECOLOPES. Find out more about our research on www.ecolopes.org and on our social media platforms.